On April 10, 1925, F. Scott Fitzgerald published what would become his most successful novel, The Great Gatsby. Set in the jazz age of New York, the novel tells the story of Jay Gatsby, a self-made millionaire, and his pursuit of Daisy Buchanan, a wealthy young woman he loved in his youth. Along with its images of wealth, extravagant parties, lust, and love, the novel is filled with a great amount of literary techniques that makes the text both a challenging but accessible text. For this reason, the novel has been placed in the literary canon of English education, being taught at thousands of schools throughout the United States. In order to fully understand the themes of the novel, it is important to understand the historical context. The 1920s in the United States is often referred to as the Roaring Twenties, a time in which the economy was surging, there was mass consumerism, jazz ruled, the Harlem Renaissance redefined culture, women's place in society greatly altered, and the Prohibition challenged legal authority. During the 1920s, many Americans had extra money to spend, and they spent it on consumer goods, such as ready-to-wear clothes. The most important consumer product of the 1920s was the automobile. Low prices and good credit made cars affordable luxuries at the beginning of the decade. By the end, they were practically necessities. Jazz bands played at dance halls and radio stations carried their tunes to listeners across the nation. Some older people objected to jazz music's vulgarity and depravity, but many in the younger generation loved the freedom they felt on the dance floor. In the early 1900s, a few middle-class black families moved to Harlem. Due to other forces, thousands of black families soon followed throughout the 1920s. This led to a sense of black pride in the Harlem area. Soon, artists like Langston Hughes, Nora Zeal Hurston, Louis Armstrong, and others displayed that cultural pride of Harlem. This explosion of artistic and cultural creation was called the Harlem Renaissance. During this time, there was a development of the flapper. A flapper was a young woman who wore short skirts, drank, smoked, and did other unladylike actions. Although most women weren't flappers, the image of the flapper directly related to the decade. Aside from that figure, women finally earned the right to vote in 1920 and gained a more prominent role in society outside of the household. In the 1920s, the 18th Amendment of the Constitution was ratified, banning the sale of intoxicating liquors, and soon every bar, saloon, and tavern in the United States was shut down. This drove the liquor trade underground. Now, people simply went to nominally illegal speakeasies instead of ordinary bars, where it was controlled by bootleggers, racketeers, and other organized crime figures. All of this cultural change led to radical shifts in identity throughout the mass population. However, for the majority of Americans in the 1920s, it was a decade of hardship rather than roaring parties and social change. More than 60% of Americans lived just below the poverty line. This poverty was known to several groups, including farmers, old tradesmen like miners, immigrants, and Black Americans. So, while the novel highlights great wealth and joy of the Roaring Twenties, in reality, for most, it wasn't roaring. This displays an aspect of history that Fitzgerald leaves out of the text, potentially highlighting a bias towards the upper class or an intentionality of focusing solely on the upper class. In the end, this distinction must be made by each individual reader, but understanding the complete historical background within the novel is important to fully understand the societal and historical impacts of the novel.